1995 Subaru Legacy Brighton station wagon. It's a 2.2 liter engine, 5-speed transmission, all-wheel drive. And this isn't going to be a step-by-step do-it-yourself video because I have already done the 2 jobs, but I will basically give you an explanation and more or less a walkthrough. This car is new to me. It's mechanically identical to my old 1994 wagon, which actually was the previous body style. 1995 was the changeover, but aside from some incredibly minor differences, this is, for all intents and purposes, the same car. Anyhow, I bought the car about 2 weeks ago, and not during the initial test drive, but as I was after I'd paid for it and drove away, I noticed a clicking upon acceleration, and that told me the car needed at least one front CV axle. So I got the car home, put it up, and took a look at everything, but I couldn't find any torn boots. Now, normally, if you hear of something like that and you see a torn CV axle boot, you know that that axle needs to be replaced. Now, sometimes these things just will wear out and start making noise before the boots tear. So, anyhow, I'd had identical symptoms, only, much worse on my Jetta diesel, which thankfully I sold a few weeks ago. So I knew that the clicking there was a CV axle problem. So I'm going to describe that first. Anyhow, changing them out is actually a pretty simple job. I mean, you need, I'll describe as I go along, what tools you need. I'm not, like I said, it's not going to be a complete walkthrough. I'm just going to show you everything and describe it. I'm not taking anything apart today. So, I have the car up on ramps now because I have to make a few adjustments here, which I'll tell you about later. But but now that it's on ramps, I can also give you a general walkthrough of the job. So, to replace the CV axles, first, you when the car is on the ground, you have to loosen but not remove. You have to break free but not really loosen the lug bolts there. Also, the axle nut. Show you that right there. You see that indentation there? You have to actually get in there with a screwdriver or a chisel and a hammer and bend that back out. At which point, once again, we're assuming the car is on the ground, not on the ramps here. You actually have to break that axle nut free. If memory serves, it is a 30mm nut, and you're going to need a breaker bar to do that. And when you tighten it back down, I think the manual said it was 123 to 151 foot-pounds. Double check that yourself, don't take my word on it. But that's how tight it has to be when you put it back. And of course, when you put the new axle nut back on, you have to once again get the hammer and chisel and dent it like that so it grabs the axle. So once the axle nut is loosened, but don't loosen it too much, just break it free. If you take it off all the way or even loosen it too much, you could damage the wheel bearing with the car's weight still on it. So, just break it free. Do not loosen it any further than that. Once you're done with that, you jack the car up and support it with a good jack stand. Do not use the factory jack, and of course it's impossible to do this car here on the ramps because the wheel has to come off. A jack stand is an absolute must. So, once the car's up in the air, the wheel comes off, and that nut comes off. And then we get under here to show you the next part of it. So the next thing I do is I loosen and remove the strut to control arm bolts here. They're likely going to be in there pretty tight. You can see I put them back together with anti-seize compound. That's generally something I do whenever I do work on a Subaru, to make the repair job much easier the next time. So, see if I can even get behind here to show you. I probably can't, but give it a try anyway. Maybe I'll try with the light here. Oh yeah, that makes a difference. If you look there, you see some silver paint. Now, you don't want to just, you don't want to remove these two bolts willy-nilly. The bottom one, that's fine, but the top one actually adjusts the wheel camber. So, in order to preserve that and not screw up your wheel alignment, what you really need to do is, like what I did here, get some touch-up paint and mark the relative position of that bolt to the strut there. That way, when you put it all back together, you just realign those paint marks, and your alignment is therefore back where it was and preserved. So, once you have those loose, and also you want to get the, this car has anti-lock brakes, so you want to get the ABS sensor wire there out of the way. And let's see if I can show you right here. Once again, I apologize for how difficult it is to see everything. In order to give yourself more clearance, you can actually undo these two bolts and just get this plate out of the way. It'll give you a few more inches clearance. And then next, you're actually going to want to, if you, let's see if I can show you right here. It's actually very hard to see this, but right there is the other end of the CV axle. And it's near impossible to see this from this side. It's actually, you can get a much better view from the driver's side here. Now, it's actually held to the transmission by a spring pin. And for the driver's side of the car, it's actually, in my experience, much easier to access the spring pin from the bottom here. You can see that it's extending out a little bit. For whatever reason, these new CV axles I bought, which are aftermarket, brand new, not rebuilt, the hole that they drilled seems to be slightly misaligned, and I tried for an hour. I really was not able to drive that pin in any further, but it is perfectly secure. I drove the car yesterday. I really don't think that's going to come out. And once again, I'm taking a risk there, but I really think that's going to be okay, at least in my situation. So, but anyhow, you get a hammer and a punch, and you drive that out. Like I said, on the driver's side of the car, which you see here, I find it much easier to access this pin from the bottom, but on the passenger side, the exhaust here is in the way. So what I usually do is I take out the air filter housing and the intake tube, and I actually get that pin from the top on the passenger side. I find it works much easier that way. So once that's done, you can pull the control arm out of the way, and you're going to have to wrestle with it a bit, but you'll get the axle out, and you'll be able to pull the axle out of the transmission. In rare circumstances, the axle will pull the stub shaft out of the transmission. Now that did happen to me once, not on this car, but on my wife's Impreza, and if that happens, don't panic. Sometimes the axle shafts will rust and just really, seize themselves to the output shaft and the transmission, in which case what you have to do is separate the two. And in order to do that, I actually had to work at it for quite some time with some heat and some penetrating oil, but eventually I got it. And then I was able to just get a rubber hammer and just pound the shaft right back into the transmission. It went right back in. There's a circlip on it. It locked itself in place, And once again, that was my wife's car, and 50,000 miles later, it's still just fine. So, but I digress. Once the axle is out, the process is reversed. You just put the new one in. You know, lock your pin there to the transmission. Put the axle there through the control arm. You know, reassemble everything you took apart here. Now these strut bolts go to 100 pounds, and like I said, make sure you realign the paint marks on the other side so you preserve your alignment settings. Otherwise, you got to take the car right in for an alignment, and that's going to cost you money. And then once everything's together here, you put the new axle nut on, lock it down as tightly as you can. One way I find best to do that is, once you have it locked as much as you can, of course you have to bolt the wheel back on. And before you lower the car, I find it's easiest just to brace the wheel by hand, and as such I'm able to tighten the nut even a little more. Once it's really as tight as you can get it by hand, you lower the car to the ground, and then block the wheels and lock that nut down there to, like I said, I think the Haynes manual specifies 123 to 151 foot-pounds. Get the manual, make sure you get the torque settings correctly. And then once that's in, you just dent the nut like that to make sure it grabs the CV axle and does not come loose. Torque your lug nuts down there and put the hubcap back on. I mean, if everything goes smoothly, I've done these axles as quickly as in just over an hour. It's really not a bad job. The first time I did it, I was a bit intimidated, so I didn't actually... the very first time I took it to a shop, and that cost me, you know, parts and labor total about $300. These days I can find the axle for maybe about $40, maybe $60, and do the job myself. It's much quicker and easier. So, that's my tip on that.